There was a time when the idea of Linux surpassing Windows in any meaningful way sounded like wishful thinking from enthusiasts who enjoyed tinkering in terminals and compiling kernels for fun. For decades, Microsoft Windows dominated the desktop, shaped enterprise infrastructure, defined gaming, and dictated the direction of consumer computing. Linux, while powerful and respected in servers and embedded systems, lived on the margins of mainstream personal computing, but something has changed. Quietly at first, then undeniably. Linux just crossed a line Windows can't follow, and it changes everything about the future of computing. To understand why this moment matters, you have to look beyond market share charts and beyond the surfacely level debates about user interfaces. This isn't about whether GNOME feels smoother than Windows 11 or whether KDE Plasma looks more customizable. It's about philosophy, control, architecture, and the direction the computing world is heading. Linux crossed a structural line, not a cosmetic one. And Windows, because of its business model, legacy burden, and corporate incentives, cannot cross that same line without fundamentally breaking itself. For years, Microsoft gradually transformed Windows from a product you bought into a service you're enrolled in. With Windows 10 and then Windows 11, the operating system became tightly integrated with cloud services, telemetry, subscription models, account synchronization, advertising surfaces, and AI layers that are increasingly cloud-dependent. Features that once lived locally now talk to remote servers. Updates arrive when Microsoft decides. System components evolve without clear boundaries. Even core features like search and AI assistance increasingly depend on remote processing. Linux, on the other hand, doubled down on local sovereignty. Distributions matured to the point where you can have a fully featured desktop, development environment, gaming platform, and production workstation without being required to log into a corporate account or tie your machine to a centralized cloud identity. That line between user and vendor has become sharper. Linux crossed into a space where the user is unquestionably in control of the machine. The rise of distributions like Ubuntu made Linux accessible to millions. Fedora pushed cutting-edge technologies like Wayland and Pipewire into mainstream use. Linux cultivated a culture of deep customization and learning. Linux Mint offered familiarity to users migrating from Windows. Each of these distros represents a branch of an ecosystem that is not governed by a single corporate roadmap. The line Linux crossed is decentralization with usability. Historically, decentralization meant fragmentation and friction. Today, it means choice without chaos. Flatpak and Snap standardized app distribution across distributions. Wayland modernized the display stack. Pipewire unified audio and video handling. Proton transformed gaming compatibility. These weren't incremental tweaks. They were systemic evolutions that moved Linux into a new era. Gaming was once the strongest argument against Linux. DirectX reigned supreme. Studios targeted Windows first. Anti-cheat systems refused to cooperate. But then Valve introduced Proton and the Steam Deck, effectively normalizing Linux as a gaming platform. Proton bridged the compatibility gap without forcing developers to rewrite everything. Suddenly, thousands of Windows games ran seamlessly on Linux. This wasn't Linux chasing Windows anymore. It was Linux redefining compatibility on its own terms. Windows cannot replicate that move because Proton's success is built on open standards and translation layers that operate outside Microsoft's control. Windows gaming dominance depends on proprietary APIs and vendor lock-in. Linux's gaming rise depends on abstraction and openness. That philosophical difference is the line. Then there's the hardware story. Microsoft pushes specific hardware requirements, from TPM mandates to secure boot constraints. Windows 11 drew a firm line in the sand about what hardware qualifies as modern. Linux, in contrast, runs on everything from aging ThinkPads to bleeding-edge ARM systems to single-board computers. The adaptability of the Linux kernel is staggering. It powers Android phones, cloud data centers, supercomputers, routers, TVs, and IoT devices. The desktop is just one expression of its capability. When Apple transitioned to ARM, Microsoft followed cautiously. Linux was already there. ARM support in the kernel matured rapidly, and distributions began supporting ARM laptops and development boards in earnest. The same kernel that runs on a Raspberry Pi can scale to a supercomputer cluster. Windows does not have that architectural elasticity. The cloud amplified this divergence. Most of the internet runs on Linux. Containers, Kubernetes clusters, microservices, serverless backends, CI pipelines, AI training infrastructure. Linux is the default substrate. Windows exists in the cloud, yes, but Linux defines it. The skills developers build, the tooling they rely on, the workflows they automate, all revolve around Linux environments. When developers choose their personal systems, that cloud dominance bleeds into desktop choice. Using Linux locally aligns with deploying Linux in production. The friction disappears. WSL Windows Subsystem for Linux is Microsoft's acknowledgement of that reality. Instead of making developers adapt to Windows, Microsoft embedded Linux inside Windows. That move alone signals that the gravitational center shifted. But embedding Linux is not the same as being Linux. WSL operates within Windows constraints. It's a compatibility layer, not a replacement of philosophy. Linux crossed the line into being the primary environment for modern development, cloud-native workflows, and containerized infrastructure. Windows adapted by importing Linux rather than redefining itself around open governance. Security is another dimension of this shift. Windows historically prioritized backward compatibility, carrying legacy components forward for decades. Linux distributions can deprecate, replace, and modernize more aggressively. Wayland replaces X11, systemed restructured init systems. File systems like BTRFs and ZFS introduce advanced snapshotting and integrity features. The community debates, experiments, iterates, and eventually moves forward. Microsoft cannot easily drop decades of compatibility without disrupting enterprises worldwide. Linux distributions can choose different trade-offs, and flexibility allows faster evolution. Privacy also plays into this transformation. Telemetry in Windows became increasingly visible. Ads in the Start menu, suggested apps, mandatory accounts. These changes eroded trust for some users. Linux distributions generally avoid built-in advertising and mandatory telemetry. The user decides what data leaves the machine. That sense of ownership resonates in an era where digital autonomy feels fragile. The line Linux crossed as cultural as much as technical became normal. It's pre-installed on laptops from major vendors. Developers proudly list it as their daily driver. Creators edit video, produce music, and stream from Linux machines. Gamers boot into KDE Plasma sessions without feeling like they're compromising. Students learn programming on Linux laptops instead of treating it as a server curiosity. Windows, meanwhile, faces identity tension. Is it a local OS, cloud gateway, a subscription platform, an AI wrapper? Its direction seems increasingly shaped by services revenue rather than user sovereignty. Linux's direction, fragmented though it may be, remains anchored in community governance and open standards. Artificial intelligence further exposes the divergence. Running AI models locally on Linux is often simpler due to native tooling, driver support, and open-source ecosystems. Developers experiment with PyTorch, TensorFlow, CUDA, or OCM primarily on Linux, while Windows supports these tools. The documentation, community scripts, and deployment patterns are Linux. First, the explosion of local AI inference highlights the importance of system transparency. Users want to know what runs on their machines. They want to manage GPU drivers, tweak kernels, allocate memory. Linux empowers that tinkering. Windows abstracts it away under layers of proprietary management. Corporate strategy also shapes the future. Microsoft must protect Azure revenue, Office subscriptions, and enterprise contracts. Windows becomes an extension of those services. Linux distributions are not beholden to a single monetization channel. Some are backed by companies, others by communities. But none dictate the direction of computing at the scale Microsoft attempts. The educational world mirrors this shift. Computer science curricula rely heavily on Linux environments. Students learn Bash, Git, Docker, SSH tools native to Linux culture. When those students graduate, their comfort zone isn't the Windows registry. It's the Linux shell. That generational change compounds over time. Even user interface design reflects deeper philosophy. Desktop environments like GNOME aim for minimalism and workflow efficiency. KDE Plasma emphasizes customization and modularity. Both operate on compositors like Wayland that prioritize security and modern graphics pipelines. Windows retains a hybrid UI, blending legacy control panels with modern settings. That coexistence of old and new signals, structural inertia, the line Linux crossed is irreversibility. It no longer depends on Windows for validation. It no longer needs to mimic Windows to survive. It stands as a parallel universe of computing that influences hardware vendors, software developers, and enterprise architecture. Microsoft's attempt to integrate AI deeply into Windows through cloud-based assistants and services may accelerate this divergence. Linux can integrate AI locally or via open APIs without central mandates. Users can choose their models, frameworks, and workflows. In emerging markets and educational institutions where cost matters, Linux offers freedom from licensing fees. Governments concerned about digital sovereignty adopt Linux-based solutions to avoid dependency on foreign corporations. That geopolitical dimension strengthens Linux's trajectory. When you zoom out, you see a pattern. Linux powers the backbone of the internet. It dominates supercomputing. It thrives in embedded systems. It now runs games once exclusive to Windows. It supports creative professionals. It fuels AI research. And it does so without locking users into a singular corporate ecosystem. Windows cannot cross that same line without dismantling its proprietary foundations. It cannot fully open its governance without jeopardizing its revenue model. It cannot abandon backward compatibility without alienating enterprise clients. It cannot decentralize without losing control. This doesn't mean Windows disappears. It remains powerful, widely used, and deeply integrated into business workflows. But its trajectory differs fundamentally from Linux's. One centralizes and monetizes. The other decentralizes and empowers. The moment Linux crossed that line wasn't marked by a headline or a product launch. It was gradual. It was Proton improving compatibility week by week. It was Wayland stabilizing across distributions. It was developers defaulting to Linux containers. It was students installing Linux as their first OS. It was gamers realizing they didn't need a Windows partition anymore. It changes everything because computing's future leans toward openness, containerization, distributed systems, and local AI autonomy. Linux aligns with those trends at a structural level. Windows adapts to them from a position shaped by legacy and monetization imperatives. The psychological shift may be the most profound. Users no longer see Linux as a compromise. They see it as a choice. A confident, capable, mature choice. That confidence fuels adoption. In the end, the line Linux crossed is about ownership. Who owns your machine? Who decides how it evolves? Who controls updates, telemetry, integrations? Linux answers, you do. Windows answers, we manage it for you. And in an era where digital agency matters more than ever, that difference isn't small. It's foundational. It redefines not just which operating system you use, but what computing means in the first place.